Daenerys Targaryen was never meant to be gentle. She was built around control, justice, and belief in destiny. From the beginning, her identity wasn't a kind ruler. It was a rightful one. And that distinction matters. Because when you watch her journey from the very first season, every major decision reveals the same pattern. She didn't negotiate with slavers. She didn't reform oppressive systems gradually. She broke them completely, and she never questioned whether that approach was right. She questioned whether she was being merciful enough while doing it. That's not the psychology of someone learning to govern. That's the psychology of someone who believes the world is divided into two categories: those who deserve power and those who don't. And she knew exactly which side she belonged to. Spoilers ahead. Most viewers saw her as evolving, learning, becoming wiser with each season. But if you track her decisions instead of her intentions, a different pattern emerges. She didn't become more merciful as she gained power. She became more certain. And certainty in someone who sees themselves as fundamentally right doesn't lead to compromise. It leads to escalation. Every time she chose fire, every time she chose public execution, every time she rejected counsel that suggested patience, she was reinforcing the same core belief that the world doesn't need negotiation. It needs correction, and she was the one destined to correct it. Daenerys was driven by three core forces that never wavered. First, entitlement. She didn't want power. She believed it belonged to her. Every time someone challenged her claim, she didn't defend it politically. She defended it as a fundamental truth. The throne wasn't a goal. It was a birthright that had been stolen. And that framing changes everything. Because when you believe something belongs to you by nature, taking it isn't ambition, it's correction. When Viserys told her they would take back what was theirs, he wasn't teaching her to desire power. He was teaching her that the current world order was a temporary malfunction, and she internalized that completely. Watch how she responds when people don't immediately recognize her claim. She doesn't argue. She doesn't campaign. She states her titles. She lists her achievements. She expects the logic to be self-evident. And when it isn't, when someone like Jon Snow has an equal or stronger claim, she doesn't see it as a political complication. She sees it as a fundamental wrongness in how people are perceiving reality. Because in her framework, the rightful ruler should be obvious. The blood should matter. The destiny should be clear. And if people can't see it, the problem isn't with her claim. The problem is with them. Second, moral absolutism. People were either oppressors or victims. There was no middle ground. When she freed slaves, she didn't see a complex economic system that needed restructuring. She saw evil that needed to be destroyed. And she was right about the evil. The slave masters were genuinely monstrous. But the lack of nuance wasn't a flaw in her youth. It wasn't something she would outgrow. It was her operating system. She measured morality in binaries. And binaries don't allow for gradual reform. They demand total transformation. This is why every liberation she performed followed the same template. Identify the oppressor. Destroy them completely. Expect immediate gratitude. And when the aftermath got complicated, when freed slaves struggled, or when power vacuums created new violence, she didn't re-examine her method. She doubled down. The problem wasn't that fire doesn't solve governance. The problem was that she hadn't burned enough of the old world yet. That logic doesn't lead to moderation. It leads to expansion. More fire, more certainty, more absolute solutions. Third, external validation. Her sense of self depended entirely on how others reacted to her power. When people called her Misa, when they worshipped her, when they feared her, she felt aligned with her purpose. Those weren't just pleasant moments. They were confirmations. Proof that she was on the right path. Proof that the world recognized what she was. But when they questioned her, when they hesitated, when they chose someone else, she didn't just feel rejected. She felt like reality itself was malfunctioning. Because in her framework, the right ruler should inspire the right response. Automatically, naturally. And this is the part the story understood, but didn't fully explore. Daenerys didn't just want to rule. She needed to be seen as the obvious choice. The destined choice. When Westeros didn't embrace it the way Essos had, when the people feared her dragons instead of celebrating them, when Jon got cheers while she got silence, it wasn't political resistance. It was personal betrayal. The world was rejecting not just her claim, but her identity. And that kind of rejection doesn't lead to self-reflection in someone built like this. It leads to rage. Or worse, it leads to cold recalculation. That psychology doesn't suddenly collapse. It evolves in one direction. And the story knew this. You can see it in how consistently she escalated. Crucifying the masters wasn't a loss of control. It was calculated demonstration. She chose a number to match their cruelty. She made it public. She made it symbolic. Burning the cause wasn't rage. It was strategy. She walked into that temple knowing exactly what she was going to do and why it would work. Even feeding a master to her dragons was presented as justice, not cruelty. She didn't act out of emotion in those moments. She acted out of certainty. And certainty is far more dangerous than anger, because anger burns out, certainty builds. So when the story needed her to break King's Landing, it didn't need to make her cruel. She had already shown she could be ruthless. It didn't need to make her unstable. She had already shown she could justify extreme violence. What it needed to show was a progression from targeted ruthlessness to indiscriminate destruction. And that's where the logic fractures. Because the problem isn't that Daenerys became ruthless. The problem is how fast the story skipped the internal process. Her final decision wasn't preceded by sustained doubt, internal conflict, or moral rationalization. Instead, it arrived fully formed. One conversation with Tyrion, one moment of isolation, one look at the Red Keep. And suddenly, the character who had always justified her violence as liberation decided that burning civilians was necessary. Not over weeks, not through a series of smaller compromises. In one episode, the story treated her turn as a reaction. But for this character, it should have been a conclusion. And that's a narrative error. Because reactions are emotional. Conclusions are ideological. Daenerys didn't need to snap. She needed to arrive at a belief that mercy had failed, that half measures had failed, that her willingness to be loved instead of feared had failed, and that the only way to build the world she envisioned was to destroy the world that rejected her. That process takes time, not because she's slow, but because belief systems don't rewrite themselves in an afternoon. They erode, piece by piece, justification by justification, and the show had the pieces. It just didn't assemble them. She had already lost Yora, the one person who believed in her, without needing her to prove anything. She had already lost Missandei, her connection to the people she had actually freed. She had already seen Jon celebrated while she was feared. She had already burned the Tarleys and felt nothing. She had already rejected Tyrion's counsel multiple times. All of that could have been the foundation, but foundation requires construction, and construction requires scenes. Scenes where she talks herself into it, where she tests the logic, where she asks Tyrion what happens if mercy keeps failing, and he has no answer that satisfies her, where she sees the people of King's Landing not as innocents, but as complicit, because they didn't open the gates. They didn't rise up against Cersei. They didn't choose her. They chose Cersei or they chose no one. Either way, they didn't choose the rightful queen. And if they couldn't see what was right, then they were part of the problem, not bystanders. Enablers. That's not a snap decision. That's a radicalization arc. And radicalization doesn't happen in a moment. It happens in a series of moments where the person rebuilds their moral framework piece by piece until the unthinkable becomes thinkable, then necessary, then inevitable. We've seen this in history. We've seen this in other stories. The person who starts with righteous anger and ends with indiscriminate destruction doesn't get there through one bad day. They get there through 100 small justifications that each make sense in isolation, but together create a completely different moral universe. What was missing was patience. A consistent arc would have shown gradual isolation, not sudden loneliness. It would have shown her testing her new logic. Maybe she burns a building as a warning and watches how people react. Maybe she executes prisoners not for justice, but for efficiency and justifies it as necessary. Maybe she starts seeing hesitation as betrayal. Small moments where we watch the framework shift, where her advisors start to realize they can't argue her down anymore because her logic is internally consistent. It's just morally horrifying. If the story had given her 3 full episodes instead of rushing it into one, if it had shown her arriving at these conclusions through visible, trackable steps, if it had let us see Tyrion and Jon slowly realize that they're not talking to someone who's broken, but someone who's simply become more what they always were, then the final act wouldn't feel like a break. It would feel like the last step in a process we've been watching. Instead, what we got was implication without construction. The story told us she had become this. It didn't show us her becoming it. And those are not the same thing. One is character development. The other is plot necessity. And when a character is carefully built as Daenerys gets reduced to plot necessity, the ending doesn't land as tragedy. It lands as contrivance. So what does a logically consistent ending actually look like? A consistent ending doesn't make Daenerys softer. It makes her colder. Instead of reacting emotionally to bells and surrender, she acts strategically. She makes a choice that's been building for episodes. Not a choice made in rage, but a choice made in absolute certainty. She doesn't burn all of King's Landing because she's lost control. She burns one district, one specific, carefully chosen district, the wealthiest quarter, the one that benefited most from Lannister rule, the one that had every resource, every opportunity to open the gates and didn't. And she does it after the city surrenders, not during the battle, after, because the message isn't about winning the battle. It's about what happens to those who don't choose correctly. She makes it public. She makes it clear. She addresses the survivors and explains in that calm, certain voice that this wasn't cruelty. This was education. The old world is gone. The new world has one rule: choose the right side or become a lesson for others. Then she stops. She accepts the surrender. She takes the throne. And she begins building her new order. No screaming, no collapse, no madness, just absolute certainty that what she did was necessary. She doesn't kill Jon out of paranoia. She offers him a place at her side. She doesn't spiral. She governs. Efficiently, ruthlessly, absolutely. She creates a new council. She establishes new laws. She's not a mad queen. She's a revolutionary who believes the cause was justified. And the horror isn't that she's broken. The horror is that she's not. She's exactly who she always said she was. The breaker of chains, the burner of cities, the queen who was promised. And she believes completely that what she's doing is right. That's the ending that fits the character that was built. Not a tragic fall into madness. A tragic ascension into absolute power with absolute certainty. Because the most dangerous rulers aren't the ones who lose control. They're the ones who never doubt themselves. And Daenerys never learned to doubt. She learned to justify. She learned to escalate. She learned that the world would resist, and that resistance needed to be broken. That's not insanity. That's ideology. And ideology doesn't snap into place. It builds. Daenerys didn't fall because she was weak. She fell because the story rushed where it needed patience. When an ending ignores who a character has become, the story ends early, even if the credits keep rolling.